Her hands told the story before her lips ever could. They were not soft, not the kind that wore perfume or glittered with rings. They were wrinkled, cracked, and scarred, every line carved by a lifetime of struggle. Calluses sat like armor on her palms, reminders of scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled, carrying crates too heavy for her frame, sewing deep into the night just to make sure little bellies never went to bed empty. When Ruth Carter's hands reached for anything, bread dough, laundry, or a child's cheek, they carried both the strength of survival and the tenderness of love. People often said you could tell a person's history by looking into their eyes, but with Ruth, it was her hands. They were history. They were sacrifice. Ruth hadn't been given much to begin with. Orphaned as a girl, she learned early that the world does not hand out kindness freely. She remembered nights of curling into herself under a thin blanket, her stomach gnawing with hunger, her ears ringing with the silence of being forgotten. She could have grown bitter. She could have learned selfishness, turned her back on everyone as the world had once turned its back on her. But Ruth chose differently. She carried the ache of abandonment in her heart and swore no child she could touch would ever feel the same. That was why, years later, when 3 children needed a home, she didn't pause. Ethan, Claire, and David weren't hers by blood. They were white children from broken beginnings, left adrift in a world that often fails the small and helpless. Ruth did not see color, nor the burden others claimed would follow. She saw hungry eyes, shivering shoulders, and hearts that deserved love. She gave them her name, her home, her sweat, and her dignity. Every coin she earned went to shoes on their feet, books in their hands, food on their plates. When they stumbled, she lifted them. When they cried, she soothed them. And when they laughed, it was her soul that felt stitched back together. Neighbors sometimes marveled at her devotion. They'd watch her limp home from shifts that left her body shaking, her hands raw, still carrying groceries meant for little mouths that weren't even her own. She gives too much, they whispered behind their curtains. One day, she'll break herself in half for them. Their words floated on the wind, but Ruth never let them take root. What was too much when measured against a child's smile? What was too heavy when it meant a boy or girl could grow without fear of being unloved? Still, in quiet moments, Ruth wondered if the neighbors were right. She would catch her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, cheeks hollow, eyes tired, hands so battered they seemed carved from stone, and whisper, "You have to keep going." She carried her limp like a shadow of battles long fought, but she never let it slow her spirit. Her dignity was the one thing no poverty could steal. Ruth Carter was no saint. She was simply a woman who had chosen again and again to put others before herself, even when it left her with nothing. And though the town respected her, they pitied her too. They thought she didn't see the pity in their eyes when she walked past. She did. But Ruth had lived too long with emptiness to let pity define her. Her hands might have been worn thin, but they still held the power to lift others. And as long as she breathed, she would keep lifting. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that those same battered hands would one day pull open a secret buried in ruins, a secret that would turn her humiliation into power and flip the story of her life forever. The change came quietly, like a shadow slipping under the door. Ruth Carter didn't notice it at first, not in the way her children smiled at her or called out "Mama" when they came home from college breaks, but it was there, buried beneath their laughter, stitched into the way their eyes lingered on her a moment too long, as if weighing something. Love was still there, yes, but it was thinner now, stretched, and behind it, something colder was waiting. Ethan, her eldest, had always been proud. As a boy, he puffed his chest out when she sewed patches onto his pants, telling the other kids, "My mama made this." She remembered the fire in his eyes when she cheered at his school debates, the way he'd grip her hand as if drawing strength from her. But college changed him. His voice grew sharper, his words smoother, his pride swollen by the company he kept. He came home wearing tailored suits she hadn't paid for, talking about networks and connections, words that didn't belong to the boy she raised. When he looked at her now, there was no spark of shared triumph, only impatience, as though her very presence slowed him down. Claire, the middle child, had always been her little songbird. She'd twirl in the kitchen while Ruth cooked, humming lullabies Ruth herself had hummed years before. But somewhere between her teenage dances and the university halls, Claire's twirls stiffened into poses meant for photographs, her laughter molded for approval. She began to talk more about appearances, what her friends wore, who had money, whose families hosted grand dinners. When she looked at Ruth, it was with a glance that seemed to carry both love and embarrassment, like a daughter caught between gratitude and shame. David, the youngest, had once been her shadow. He followed her everywhere, tugging on her skirts, begging for another story before bed. His heart had been the softest, the one that clung the longest. But as he grew older, that softness turned restless. He became the charmer at parties, always laughing the loudest, always surrounded by friends. Yet his laughter never reached his eyes anymore. When Ruth asked if he was sleeping enough or eating well, he'd brush her off with a grin that didn't quite hide the dark circles beneath. She saw in him not just recklessness, but a quiet running from what she didn't know. It started with whispers Ruth wasn't supposed to hear. Friends of her children sitting in the living room, voices dripping with careless arrogance. "She holds you back, doesn't she? An old woman with nothing. She's a burden, Ethan, dead weight." They laughed, dismissing her as though she were furniture in her own home. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching a dish towel, her throat tightening. She told herself it was just youthful cruelty, words meant for show. Her children would defend her, she thought. They had to. But when she glanced at them, waiting for a word, a protest, even a laugh to cut the tension, she saw only silence. Ethan shifted in his seat but said nothing. Claire lowered her eyes. David fidgeted with his glass. None of them looked at her, and that silence was louder than any insult. Neighbors began to notice too. They'd see Ethan walking 2 steps ahead of Ruth at the market, Claire introducing her friends but never her mother, David pretending not to hear when she called out. "Kids these days," the neighbors whispered, shaking their heads. "They're forgetting who raised them." And though Ruth smiled at the whispers, her heart trembled with fear that maybe, just maybe, they were right. She tried to dismiss it, convincing herself it was only the growing pains of adulthood. Children pull away, she thought. It's part of life. But in the quiet of night, when she sat alone at the kitchen table, with her hands folded, she felt the weight of something slipping. Something she couldn't hold on to. Love had never failed her before. But now, for the first time, Ruth Carter wondered if love was enough to keep them from turning away. And deep down, she feared she already knew the answer. The Sunday air was thick with the smell of roasted chicken and warm cornbread. Ruth Carter hummed softly as she set the table, her limp slowing her steps but never touching the joy in her heart. Cooking for her children had always been her love language. No matter how old they grew, no matter how far they traveled, she believed a meal prepared by her hands could still remind them of home. She ladled collard greens into a bowl, her fingers aching from the weight of the pot, and whispered to herself, "They'll like this. They always have." The table looked like something out of memory, golden chicken crisping under the light, cornbread steaming in its cast-iron pan, glasses set neatly in front of each plate. She had even polished the silverware that morning, rubbing each fork and knife until it gleamed. For Ruth, it wasn't just dinner. It was proof. Proof that though her body was tired, her love was not. She heard their voices before she saw them. Ethan's low baritone, sharp and commanding. Claire's lighter, threaded with laughter meant to impress. David's careless chuckle echoing behind. And then others, their friends, young men and women who dressed too fine, smelled of expensive perfume, and carried the arrogance of people who had never truly known hunger. Ruth's heart pinched. She hadn't expected company, but no matter. There was enough food to go around. "Come sit," Ruth said warmly, motioning to the table. Her voice trembled with eagerness like a child offering a gift. But Ethan didn't sit. He stood tall, arms folded across his chest, his jaw clenched as if the weight of her very presence pressed on him. Claire slid into a chair quickly, avoiding her mother's eyes. David lingered by the doorway, shifting from one foot to the other, while their friends smirked at the spread before them. The silence stretched as Ruth lowered herself into her chair, her limp making the movement heavy. She smiled through it. "I made your favorite, Ethan, just like you liked it when you were little." She reached for his plate, ready to serve him. That was when it happened. "Why do we still let her stay here?" Ethan's words cut through the room, low but sharp enough to slice bone. He didn't whisper. He wanted her to hear. His eyes flicked toward his friends, then back at his siblings. "She's dead weight." The words hung in the air like a noose. Ruth froze, the serving spoon slipping from her hand and clattering against the plate. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. Her chest tightened as she looked at Claire, at David, hoping, desperately hoping, that one of them would speak, that one of them would stand. But Claire only shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed into a thin line. David lowered his gaze to the floor, his shoulders tense, as if the shame was too heavy to meet her eyes. Not one word came to her defense, not even a whisper of love. Their friends chuckled, cruel and careless. "Man, if that was me, I'd put her out already," one said, stabbing a piece of cornbread with his fork. Another laughed louder, nudging Ethan as if he'd said something clever. The room buzzed with approval, but to Ruth it was only the sound of betrayal ringing in her ears. Her heart stuttered. These were the children she had carried in her soul, the ones she had clothed with her wages, the ones whose hunger she had starved herself to fill. She remembered late nights stitching Claire's dresses, early mornings packing Ethan's lunch, long afternoons rocking David when fevers stole his sleep. All of it, all of her life, now dismissed with 2 words: dead weight. Ruth pushed herself slowly to her feet. Her body trembled, not from age this time, but from the blow that had just landed deep in her spirit. She searched their faces, one by one. Ethan's prideful smirk, Claire's silence, David's averted eyes. None of them saw her as mother anymore. They saw her as burden. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke, though she tried to steady it. "Is that truly what I am to you? Dead weight?" The question broke in the air, unanswered. Their silence told her more than any words could. The friends laughed again, the sound echoing like cruel applause in a theater built of her broken heart. And in that moment, Ruth Carter understood something she had never allowed herself to believe. The love she had poured into her children, the sacrifices written in the scars of her hands, had not shielded her from the coldness of ingratitude. It was the beginning of the end. The evening air was heavy, colder than the season should have allowed, or maybe it only felt that way because Ruth's heart had turned to stone. She stood in the doorway with her small worn bag at her feet. Inside it were only a few dresses, a Bible with its leather cover cracked from years of use, and an envelope holding exactly $1,000, her last lifeline. It wasn't even money she'd been saving for herself. It was scraps left over, coins and bills put aside after the children insisted they'd take care of the bigger expenses. Now those same children had told her she was nothing but a burden. Her fingers gripped the doorknob a little too long. She wanted to turn back, to see if one of them, any of them, would rush in behind her, call her mama again, and beg her to stay. But the house was silent, and the silence was crueler than words. Not a single step echoed down the hall. Not a single hand reached for her. Neighbors gathered like shadows at the end of the street, their whispers flowed. Aiding through the dusk, curtains shifted, voices hissed low, but she heard them all the same. Lord have mercy. After all she did for them? Kids these days. Peer pressure's eaten their souls. She gave them her life, and they threw her out like trash. The words pierced, but Ruth kept her head high. She would not let them see her broken. Her limp made her gait uneven, but she carried herself with dignity, every step an act of defiance against the shame clawing at her chest. The bag weighed almost nothing, but the humiliation was heavier than any burden she had ever carried. At the corner of the street, she paused. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to shed in public. She clutched the envelope tighter in her pocket as though it were her very breath. $1,000, she thought. That was all she had after raising 3 children, after decades of bending her body to feed and clothe them. $1,000 and an empty bag. That was her reward. That first night, Ruth didn't go far. She found herself at the bus station, sitting on a hard wooden bench under a flickering light. The air smelled of old rain and gasoline. Around her, strangers came and went, faces turned away, voices rising and falling in languages she didn't know. She folded her arms around her bag and pulled her coat tighter. Sleep never came. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Ethan's jaw stiff with pride, Claire's lips pressed in silence, David's eyes sliding away. By morning, her body ached from the cold. A man sweeping the floor nearby muttered to another worker, "Look at her, dressed neat but nowhere to go. Must have been thrown out." The other man didn't even glance up. "That's what happens when you outlive your usefulness," he said flatly. The words stabbed, but Ruth didn't flinch. She had learned long ago to keep her pain behind her eyes. The days blurred together after that. She walked the town with her limp dragging her slower each day, searching for a place to lay her head. Rent was too high, shelters were too crowded, doors closed before she could even finish her story. She tried to keep her dignity intact, but hunger pressed hard, gnawing at her insides. She stood once outside a bakery, the smell of bread twisting her empty stomach. Inside, 2 young women glanced at her through the window and whispered, "Isn't that the old lady from Ridge Street? Didn't her kids kick her out?" "Yeah. Can you imagine? Raising kids to turn on you like that?" Their pity stung worse than hunger. Ruth turned away. She would not beg. She had given too much of her life to be reduced to begging now. By the 3rd day, her body was weak, but her spirit refused to break. When she wandered past a crumbling neighborhood on the edge of town, her eyes stopped on a house leaning against the wind, like a man too tired to stand. The roof was half gone, windows shattered, grass taller than the fence. The walls sagged under years of neglect. To anyone else, it was a ruin, a skeleton of a home not worth saving. But to Ruth Carter, it was something else. Something in her chest stirred, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she stopped. The broken house called to her, and in that moment, humiliation turned into something else entirely. Not yet hope, but the first whisper of it. The house leaned like it had given up long ago. Its roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing in jagged rows that let sunlight pierce through. Broken windows stared out like hollow eyes, and the yard was nothing more than a jungle of weeds swallowing a fence that could no longer stand straight. To everyone else, it was worthless. But to Ruth Carter, it whispered. She stood at the edge of the cracked sidewalk, clutching the envelope of money deep inside H's. Neighbors passed by the next day, peering through the slats in the fence. "Poor thing," one muttered. "She wasted her last pennies on ruins. She'll never survive the winter in there." Another clucked her tongue. "She gave her life to those children, and this is what she's been left with." Ruth heard them, but she didn't answer. She wasn't buying the house to prove anything to them. She was buying it to prove something to herself. In the mornings, she rose with the sun, her hands raw as she swept away years of dust. She pulled out rusted nails with fingers that bled, piled rotten boards in corners until her back screamed. Every ache was familiar. It was the same ache she had carried raising her children, the same ache of sacrifice. But this time, she wasn't giving it to anyone else. This time, it was for her. Still, as she worked, unease lingered. She had risked everything for this ruin. If she failed here, there would be nowhere else to go. She was one breath away from despair. But on one particular afternoon, as her broom scraped across the floorboards, it struck something strange. A hollow sound. Not wood, not stone, something else. Ruth froze, her breath caught in her throat. She tapped the spot again. Hollow. Her heart thudded. Slowly, she knelt on her aching knees, pressing her fingers to the warped boards. With trembling hands, she pried at the wood until it creaked loose. Beneath it, half buried in shadows, was the outline of a small chest, its iron edges rusted, its lock corroded with age. Her pulse quickened. She stared at it, unsure if she was dreaming. Her hands shook as she reached down, brushing dust away. The chest was real, heavy, waiting. And in that forgotten, broken house, mocked by neighbors, bought with the last scraps of her life, Ruth Carter had just uncovered the first secret that would change everything. Ruth sat back on her heels, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The chest looked as though it had been waiting for her, buried beneath the rotting floorboards for decades, its iron corners eaten away by rust. Her fingers hovered above it, trembling. For a moment, she wondered if her hunger and exhaustion were playing tricks on her eyes. But no, the chest was real. She could feel the chill of the metal, the weight of history pressing against her palms. She dragged it out slowly, her body straining under the effort. The wood groaned as the box scraped against the floor, dust swirling up in clouds that made her cough. The lock was corroded, but it still clung tight. Ruth searched the house for something to break it, finally finding a rusted hammer in the corner. Her hands, scarred and weary, struck again and again until the lock cracked with a hollow snap. The lid creaked open. At first, she only saw paper. Bundles of old documents, yellowed with age, stacked neatly in leather-bound folders. She picked one up with careful fingers. Deeds, land titles, bonds with official seals. Her eyes raced over words and numbers she had no business knowing, but the stamps and signatures told her one thing clearly. They were valuable. Each paper represented wealth she had never even imagined touching. Her chest rose and fell quickly, heart pounding so hard she thought it might echo through the house. She placed the papers aside and reached deeper. Wrapped in a faded cloth at the bottom, something heavier waited. She peeled the fabric back with shaking hands. Gold. Coins stacked in rolls, dull with age but unmistakable in their shimmer. She gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth to muffle the cry that fought to escape. The coins slipped through her fingers like liquid sunlight, clinking softly as they hit the chest again. She held one up to the thin light streaming through the broken roof. Even tarnished, it gleamed. For years, she had been invisible. For years, she had bent her back and blistered her hands to raise children who now called her dead weight. And yet here in the ruins everyone mocked, she had stumbled onto destiny's forgotten treasure. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she sank to the floor. Tears burned her eyes, but these weren't the tears of humiliation she had cried in silence days ago. These were tears of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The chest wasn't just money, it was a second life. Ruth pressed her palms flat against the cold wood of the box, whispering to herself, "This is not the end. Not for me." Her voice quivered, half in disbelief, half in prayer. For the first time since her children cast her out, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. not with despair, but with possibility. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat beside the chest with her lamp burning low, unfolding each paper, tracing her fingers over every seal. She thought about the bakery where pitying eyes had followed her. She thought about the bus station bench, about the workers who said she had outlived her usefulness. She thought about her children's laughter when Ethan called her dead weight. A slow fire began to burn inside her. She would not beg. She would not crawl. She would rise, not just for herself, but to prove that broken things could still hold power. The neighbors would soon notice a change. They would see her go into town with firmer steps, selling a few coins discreetly. They would wonder where the frail, discarded woman had found her strength again. They would gossip, as neighbors always do, but Ruth would say nothing. For now, she kept her secret close, her dignity closer. The chest had given her more than gold. It had given her back her voice, and piece by piece, she would rebuild her life with it. What she didn't know yet was just how far that treasure would take her, or how fate would one day drag her children, broken and desperate, back to the very door they had once slammed behind her. Morning light spilled through the broken roof, casting streaks of gold across the dust. Ruth Carter rose from her cot, her body stiff and aching, but her spirit alive with something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. The chest still sat in the corner where she had left it, half hidden beneath a ragged sheet. Just knowing it was there filled her with strength. For the first time since being cast out, she no longer felt like a woman discarded. She felt like a woman reborn. She started small. With coins sold discreetly at an old pawn shop on the edge of town, she bought nails, planks, and paint. She didn't dare reveal how much she had truly found. Secrets like that could turn neighbors into wolves. But little by little, she began to invest in the house everyone had mocked. Her hands bled as she pulled down the rotting boards. Her back screamed as she lifted debris into piles. But for Ruth, pain had always been an old companion. She scrubbed, hammered, and stitched the ruins into order. When the work grew too heavy, she hired a few laborers, men who laughed at first, asking why a woman like her wanted to save a house like this. She only answered with silence and payment. Money spoke louder than gossip, and soon the laughter turned to labor. The neighbors noticed. They always noticed. From their porches, they watched the broken house come alive again. The leaning roof was torn down and replaced with strong beams. Fresh shingles gleamed under the sun. Windows that once gaped like empty eyes now shone with clean glass. Vines and weeds were cut back until the yard breathed again, the soil tilled, flowers daring to bloom where rot had ruled. She found help somewhere, one woman whispered, peeking over her fence. Help? Another scoffed. Oh, I'll see you. Or like luck. Poor folk don't just rebuild overnight. But Ruth ignored them. She wasn't building for them. She was building for herself. Every stroke of the paintbrush against the siding, every nail driven into fresh wood, every flower planted in her yard was more than renovation. It was resurrection. The house grew strong, and with it, so did Ruth. She stood straighter. She walked into town with her head held high, no longer the hunched figure clutching her last savings at the bus station. Her clothes were clean, pressed, her chin lifted. Her limp remained, but it no longer looked like weakness. It looked like survival. One afternoon, she paused at the garden gate, brushing soil from her palms. Children passing on the sidewalk pointed and whispered, "Isn't that the old ruin? Look at it now." Their mothers shook their heads in wonder. Even the men who once sneered now tipped their hats in respect when Ruth walked by. But she didn't stop with herself. She remembered the nights of hunger, the sting of abandonment, the cold of the bus station bench. Quietly, she set aside funds from her treasure to open a small shelter for widows and orphans. Nothing grand at first, just warm beds, hot meals, and a safe place for those who had nowhere else to go. When people asked how she managed it, she only smiled and said, "You never know what's hidden in broken places." No one knew about the chest beneath her floor. No one needed to. Let them think it was luck or charity. Ruth knew the truth. The world had tried to strip her of worth, and yet in the ruins, she had found proof that broken things could hold more power than anyone imagined. As the seasons turned, the once rotting house stood tall, its white shutters gleaming, its garden alive with blooms. Ruth Carter herself looked different too. The woman who had limped down the driveway with nothing but $1,000 was gone. In her place stood a woman draped in quiet dignity, a woman who carried herself like a queen of her own making. The neighbors' whispers shifted. Once they said, "Poor thing," now they murmured, "She's stronger than all of them." But while Ruth was rising far away, her children's lives were beginning to unravel. Ethan's pride, Claire's vanity, and David's recklessness would soon collide with consequences they could not escape. And when the winter winds came, it would not be Ruth searching for shelter. It would be them. The house on the corner no longer looked like a ruin. Its white walls gleamed under the morning sun, shutters painted fresh, the garden trimmed and full of life. Children who once crossed the street to avoid the crumbling wreck now skipped past with wide eyes, pointing to the roses climbing the fence. Ruth Carter stood on the porch, her hands folded, her chin lifted. She looked like a woman reborn, though the scars on her palms still whispered of battles fought long before. But Ruth didn't stop with her own home. She knew too well the bite of hunger, the ache of loneliness, the humiliation of being unseen. With the wealth she had uncovered, she began quietly sowing hope into the lives of others. First came the shelter, a small building with 10 beds, hot meals served every evening, and a promise that no widow or orphan in town would have to sleep cold on a bench the way she once had. Then came scholarships for children who had dreams but not the means, and seed money for women who wanted to start small businesses but had no one to believe in them. When asked how she managed it all, Ruth only smiled, her voice calm and steady. Sometimes what looks broken is simply waiting to be restored. She never revealed the chest beneath her floor. Some mysteries were better left untold. As Ruth's star rose, her children's began to fall. Ethan, once the confident eldest who spoke in polished words, had built his life on arrogance. He trusted smooth-talking partners who promised riches without risk. Papers were signed, money shifted hands, and within months his business collapsed under the weight of fraud. Investors came knocking, lawsuits piled up, and Ethan found himself drowning in debts too large to silence. The friends who once laughed at his jokes and sneered at Ruth's presence now vanished into the shadows. Claire's perfect life cracked too. Her marriage, built more on appearances than love, splintered when the bills grew higher than the walls she'd built around her pride. Her husband left, their home sold to cover debts she couldn't control. For the first time in her adult life, Claire stood in front of a mirror without jewels, without admiration, and she saw not a socialite, but a woman who had traded her mother's embrace for empty approval. David spiraled fastest of all. The charming boy who once clung to Ruth's skirts drowned his sorrows in gambling and drink. He owed money to men who didn't forgive, men whose smiles carried knives. His nights blurred into chaos, his mornings into fear. The laughter that had once been his shield turned hollow, leaving only the silence of shame. Neighbors noticed the shifts. They whispered about Ethan's failed business, Claire's broken marriage, David's debts. "Strange, isn't it?" they murmured. "The mother they called dead weight is rising, while they're all falling apart." Ruth heard those whispers too, but she carried herself with grace. She never spoke their names in bitterness. She never sought revenge. Yet inside she could not ignore the sting of irony. The children who had once cast her aside for being a burden were now the ones who had become burdens to themselves. Winter came early that year. Frost clung to windows, and the wind sliced through the streets like a blade. Ruth's house glowed with warmth, lamps lit in every room, smoke curling from the chimney, laughter echoing from the children and widows she now cared for through her foundation. But across town, her own blood shivered in houses without heat, debts stacked higher than their pride. And when desperation pressed too hard, when every door closed in their faces, when their names no longer bought them respect, there was only one door left they could think of. The same door they had once forced their mother to walk out of. The knock came on a Sunday evening, slow and hesitant, like the sound of someone unsure if they even deserved to be heard. Ruth Carter had just finished tidying the dining table, her lamp casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, the wind rattled through the trees, and frost crept along the edges of the windows. She paused, listening. No one ever knocked this late. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the door. The knock came again, weaker this time. Ruth's hand hesitated on the knob, her heart beating faster. When she opened it, the cold rushed in, and with it, 3 familiar faces. Ethan stood at the front, but he wasn't the man who had once folded his arms and sneered at her. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his confidence gone. He opened his mouth, but his voice cracked. "Mother, we lost everything." His pride, the armor he had always worn, had shattered into dust. Beside him, Claire clutched a threadbare coat around her, her hair messy, her face hollow. Tears spilled freely as she reached for Ruth's hand. "I don't know where else to go," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, Mama, I'm sorry." David lingered in the back, his shoulders slumped. He couldn't even meet her eyes. His hands shook, and the bruises along his knuckles told a story of nights he didn't want to remember. When he finally looked up, shame flooded his face. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Ruth stood in the doorway, the light of her home spilling out onto the broken figures of the children who had once laughed as their friends called her dead weight. Behind them, neighbors peeked from porches, whispering, "Ain't that the same kids who threw her out? Now look, crawling back. God doesn't sleep, tables always turn." Ruth's eyes flicked from one child to the next. She saw Ethan's arrogance stripped away, Claire's vanity shattered, David's recklessness laid bare. She remembered the sting of that Sunday dinner, the spoon clattering against the plate, the laughter that followed Ethan's cruel words. She remembered the night on the bus station bench clutching her last $1,000 while strangers dismissed her as useless. Her lips trembled, her heart heavy with the weight of both betrayal and love. "You threw me away when I was at my weakest," she said softly, her voice steady but edged with sorrow. "Yet here you are at yours." The words landed like a hammer. Ethan dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Please, forgive us," he choked. Claire collapsed beside him, clinging to Ruth's skirt like a child again. David finally lifted his head, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve it, but I have nowhere else." Tears blurred Ruth's vision. She should have turned them away. By all rights, she should have closed the door, left them in the cold as they had once left her in the dark. But Ruth Carter's heart, scarred though it was, still beat with the same rhythm it always had. Love that refused to die. Slowly she reached down, her trembling arms lifting each of them as if they were children once more. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I am still your mother, and a mother does not turn away her own." The neighbors gasped, some shaking their heads, others wiping their eyes, but Ruth didn't care what they thought. Mercy was not weakness. It was power, the same power that had carried her through hunger, humiliation, and heartbreak, the same power that had turned ruins into riches. That night, as the wind howled outside, the children who once cast her aside sat again at their mother's table. And though the road to healing would not be easy, Ruth had proven the truth the world had tried to deny. She was never dead weight. She was the weight that held everything together. The fire crackled low in the hearth, its glow painting the walls in shades of gold and shadow. Ruth Carter sat at the head of the table, her hands folded, her gaze steady on the three figures slumped before her. Ethan's face was streaked with tears. Claire's shoulders shook as she sobbed, and David's eyes stared at the polished floor, too ashamed to lift his head. The same children who had once mocked her, who had laughed when their friends called her dead weight, now sat hollow, stripped of pride, begging for the mercy they once denied her. The silence was thick, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the wind moaning outside. Ruth let it stretch, let it press on them until they felt its full weight. Her mind traveled back through every scar, every humiliation, the Sunday dinner where her spoon clattered to the plate, the long walk down the driveway with neighbors whispering, the bus station bench where she held her last $1,000 as strangers declared her useless. Every moment of pain pulsed through her veins like a heartbeat, and yet she also saw something else. She saw Ethan's first school debate, the way he had clutched her hand for courage. She saw Claire as a little girl twirling barefoot in the kitchen, humming her lullabies. She saw David curled against her side, fever burning through his body, whispering, "Don't leave me, Mama." These memories struck just as hard as the betrayals. Love us here, and pain tangled together until she could hardly separate one from the other. Finally, Ruth rose from her chair. Her limp was still there, but it no longer looked like weakness. It looked like power. She walked slowly to where her children sat. They didn't move, didn't dare breathe, afraid of the judgment in her silence. She stopped before them, her shadow falling across their bent heads. "You cast me out when I was at my weakest," she said, her voice low but steady, carrying every ounce of truth. "You turned your backs on the hands that fed you, clothed you, gave you a name when you had none. You called me dead weight." She paused, the words hanging heavy in the air. "But tell me, who carries the weight now?" Ethan broke, collapsing at her feet. "We were blind," he sobbed. "I was blind. Forgive me, Mama, please." Claire clutched at Ruth's skirt, her tears soaking the fabric. David's voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I beg for it anyway." Ruth closed her eyes. A tear slid down her cheek, but when she opened them again, her gaze was clear, resolute. She reached down and lifted Ethan first, then Claire, then David. Her arms trembled with both mercy and sorrow as she pulled them close. "I am still your mother," she whispered, her voice breaking, "and a mother does not turn away her own." The neighbors who watched from their windows gasped. Some shook their heads, others pressed hands to their mouths, tears streaming down. They would tell the story differently now, They would say, "She rose from nothing." And when her children came crawling back, she took them in. Not because they deserved it, but because her love was stronger than her hurt. Later that night, when her children finally slept under her roof again, Ruth stood alone by the window. The moonlight poured across her face, soft and silver. Behind her, the chest sat hidden beneath the floorboards, its papers and gold enough to buy kingdoms. Yeah. And she realized something the treasure had never given her, something her children now had no choice but to face. Her strength had never been measured in money. It was measured in mercy. And that was the final turn of fate. Her children thought they had returned to a woman made powerful by fortune. But what they truly returned to was a mother whose power came from something far rarer, the ability to forgive when the world expected revenge. Ruth Carter had been called dead weight, but in the end, she was the anchor, the foundation, the unshakable force that carried more than all of them combined.